third session of the day, I would like to invite the moderators, Dr. Dipankar Bavmile, Dr. P.S. Priyamvada, and Dr. Sajeev Kumar. The allotted time for this session is 6 minutes, that is 5 minutes for the presentation and 1 minute for the discussion. With that, I am going to invite the first speaker, Dr. Vamshidhar Viranki. The topic of his presentation is the outcome of mild category of SARS-CoV-2 infected renal transplant recipients managed by supervised home-based self-monitoring, a single-center experience.
A very good afternoon. I'm going to present the outcome of mild category of SARS-CoV-2 infected renal transplant recipients managed by supervised home-based self-monitoring technique, a single-center experience from our center in SGPGI, Lucknow. As we all know, COVID-19 pandemic remained as one of the biggest disasters in the last decade. Bed and oxygen scarcity versus high severity and incidence of disease led to near collapse of a healthcare system. So best utilization of limited resources had to be done, and further triage was a mandatory tool. Sickest and those that were potentially salvageable were given priority for admission. So how is COVID-19 management in renal transplant recipient different from that of a general population? The incidence, as we see, is 2 to 5 times higher than that of general population. Mortality is 10 to 20 times. These patients are at a 10 to 20 times increased risk of mortality compared to general population. And there was a 4 to 5% mortality even in a mild category COVID, which is 4 times the mortality in general population. So the challenges in management are the titration of background immunosuppression, management of COVID-19 illness per se, management of associated comorbidities and treatment-related adverse effects, monitoring the disease and allograft parameters. So because of all these challenges and increased incidence and mortality of the disease, universal admission policy was recommended by Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. So here comes an ethical dilemma, whether to admit all these patients who have a potential risk of worsening even in the mild category when they were in mild category of disease, or whether to use the limited resources managing these mild category patients at home and utilizing those limited resources for a potentially salvageable normal patients with non-immunosuppressed patients. So there was a triage required at the resources at ground level. So because of that, many of the transplant recipients in their when the disease was in mild if they are in mild category, had to be managed at home. So domiciliary management was the only left out option. But the outcomes among this cohort is not known. And we also have to remember that mortality even in mild category is 4 times that of general population. And the previous studies were there with a limited number of patients. So the aim of the current study is to compare the outcome of renal transplant recipients managed by supervised home-based self-monitoring strategy to those managed in hospital. The primary objective is to compare the rate of clinical deterioration to a higher severity category among these patients managed by HBSM technique to those managed in hospital. Patients managed in those in hospital were the historic controls of the first wave. Secondary objectives are time to clinical recovery among these two groups, the ones managed by HBSM at home and ones managed in hospital, and rates of acute graft dysfunction, graft outcome 6 weeks post-COVID, secondary bacterial infections, mean decline in EQ-5D score from baseline, and factors associated with clinical worsening among the entire mild category. So what is EQ-5D score? EQ-5D score was a validated tool for assessment of baseline functional status in a renal transplant recipient by using these 5 parameters: mobility, self-care, usual activities, pain and discomfort, and anxiety and depression. So the inclusion criteria, all the renal transplant recipients who were confirmed SARS-CoV-2 positive with mild category were either managed at home or hospital were included, and patients with moderate and severe disease category were excluded. Patients with mild category but considered unsuitable for HBSM strategy were excluded, and renal transplant recipients with a failed graft were also excluded. These were the mild category and moderate and severe category diseases that we have taken as per the ICMR guidelines. So once a renal transplant recipient, patient with affected with COVID-19 has contacted us, we have advised for admission at COVID-19 facility. We have tried for admission of that patient. If the patient is not getting admitted, then he was assessed for appropriateness of home-based self-monitoring technique, and protocol of HBSM was sent through messaging systems. So how did we assess the appropriateness for HBSM? For that, patient had to be in mild category. He or she had to maintain adequate, should have been able to maintain an adequate oral intake and should be able to maintain close communication with the transplantee. So these were the instructions that were given for these patients. Self-isolation, advised to get these instruments required for checking the vitals. Frequent communication should be maintained at least once in 24 hours. Ivermectin based protocol management as per Government of India protocol was given. Modification of immunosuppression as per the protocol we have devised, and laboratory investigations at day 5 if stable. These were the three major domains of HBSM that we have used. Management of disease per se, by home isolation, monitoring vital signs and monitoring for warning signs of worsening, and modification of immunosuppression per se, either by reduction or cessation of background immunosuppression, particularly CNIs and antimetabolites. And other management including management of blood sugar, as these were supposed to rise if we increase the steroids, and management of adequate hydration, monitoring urine output and laboratory monitoring. So these were the, this was the...
Sorry for the interruption, sir. The allotted time for you has been exceeded. I kindly request you to conclude the session.
We have a total of 251 kidney transplant recipients were managed, and of this 55 were admitted in hospital, mild patients, and 94 were in managed at home. These were the baseline characteristics which were comparable between these two groups. And the outcomes...
Please wind up in another next 30 seconds because the time is up.
Yes, ma'am. The primary outcome was similar in both the groups, that is clinical worsening. The secondary outcomes were also similar, clinical recovery, and the rate of acute graft dysfunction was higher. These were the predictors of worsening: lower baseline equified score, graft dysfunction at presentation, severe myalgias, rejection in the past 1 year, and hypertension. So,
I show your conclusion and please conclude. Show us your conclusion only, please. No discussion.
Supervised home-based self-monitoring technique has resulted in similar outcomes to that of inpatient management of renal transplant recipient with mild COVID-19, and identifying patients with potential risk factors can help in prioritizing these patients, and it remains a good strategy, particularly in face of limited inpatient services, and it is a feasible strategy for a potential third wave.
I just have one question.
Yes, sir.
How many patients at home deteriorated and needed admission subsequently?
A total of 27 patients in the domiciliary group and 15 patients in the hospitalized group, sir. That is 28% in domiciliary group, 27% in hospitalized group.
You total how many patients in the domiciliary group?
Out of total of 94 patients, 27 patients have worsened, sir.
And they needed admission?
They needed admission, yes, sir.
What was the mortality rate? Any patient expired?
There was only one mortality in mild managed at home. That was also due to delay in admission, that because of the bed scarcity at that time.
Okay, thank you. I think we've exceeded time. Can go on to the next speaker, please.
Moving on, I'd like to invite the next speaker, Dr. Megha Saigal. The topic of her presentation is Impact of Induction Therapy on Clinical Outcomes of Kidney Transplant Recipients, a Single-Center Cohort Study.
Good evening everyone, I'm Dr. Megha Saigal from Nizam's Institute of Medical Sciences, Hyderabad. I'll be talking about the impact of induction therapy on the clinical outcomes of kidney transplant recipients, a single-center cohort study. So the purpose of this study was to evaluate the long-term efficacy of the immunosuppressive drugs based on the type of induction therapy that was given to the kidney transplant recipients, whether it was ATG or basiliximab, and to see the long-term outcomes of the same. So the kidney transplant recipients who received induction therapy, whether ATG or basiliximab, were compared in 3 groups based on their graft function as immediate graft function, slow graft function, and delayed graft function. And later on, within the next 5 years, a retrospective analysis was done to see who had stable graft function, graft dysfunction, graft loss, nephrectomy, and patient death. So a total of 146 patients underwent transplants, both live and cadaveric, between the period of Jan 2017 and December 2020 in our center. And these people were included in our retrospective cohort study with a follow-up of until May 2021, that is 5 years. So as you can see, the low-risk patients were not giving any induction, whereas high-risk patients were given induction based on basiliximab and ATG based on our institute protocol. So So the risk that was calculated based on the number of the HLA mismatch, the PRA being more than 20%, presence of DSA, cold ischemia time being more, young transplant, younger recipient, older donor, and second transplant, and blood group incompatibility. The statistics that were used were SPSS 21 software, the ANOVA t-test and Wilcoxon Mann-Whitney test. Pearson's chi-square test was used to see variable between association between two variables. T-test was used to compare, and patient graft and survival analysis was done using Kaplan-Meier estimates. So these were the results. This is a table which is showing the baseline characteristics. As you can see, that basiliximab was used in more number of patients, whether it was live and or cadaver. ATG was used in less number of patients, total number of patients being 100. The donor age and the recipient age was almost comparable in both the groups. Cold ischemia time was almost slightly higher in ATG compared to basiliximab. The gender discrepancy was there, with females being much less than males in both the groups. These graph functions, rejection inspections, I'll be talking with the pictorial pictures. So this was the mean serum creatinine levels at the time of discharge. With basiliximab it was 1.3, and with ATG with basiliximab it was 1.5, and with ATG it was 1.3. However, it was not statistically significant. The incidence of rejection after the induction therapy, as you can see, the total number of rejections were more in basiliximab, 19.4% compared to ATG 8.6%, with only combined rejections being more in the ATG group. However, because there were more number of people taking basiliximab compared to ATG, statistically it was not found to be significant. Similarly, the incidence of infections after the induction therapy was found to be more with basiliximab, 46.7% compared to 21.7% with ATG. However, bacterial infections in the form of UTI was found more in the ATG group. However, this also was not a statistically significant result. Other complications like CNI toxicity, NODAD, and hypertension was also found to be more in basiliximab compared to the ATG group, however not statistically significant. The initial graft function with respect to the type of induction, as you can see, immediate graft function was seen more in ATG 60.8 compared to basiliximab 53.2. Slower graft function was more in basiliximab group. The rest were, however, this also was not statistically significant. Final graft function, although the mortality rate was slightly higher in the ATG group, 8 points, in the basiliximab group, 11.6 compared to 8.6 in the ATG group, but there was found to be no statistical difference in the final graft function. This was the outcome of the LRRT versus DDRT. As you can see, immediate graft function was more in the LRRT group as compared to DDRT group. However, at the end of 5 years, the final graft function was almost comparable between the two groups, with 69.8 in the LRRT versus 68.4 in the DDRT group. So the graft survival, this was the patient survival rate at with ATG group was 91% compared to 88% in basiliximab, and the graft survival rate was also 91.3 in the ATG group compared to 88.3 in the basiliximab group, and this was statistically significant in both groups, with p-value being 0.001. Discussion, our study has found that there was no difference.
Excuse me, you finished your time. Kindly conclude.
Yes. I'm just concluding. Our study did not find any difference in the basiliximab in ATG in DGF and acute rejection. However, graft survival and overall survival is better with ATG. Similar findings are found with Brennan et al. Liu et al. However, found basiliximab to be more superior. Conclusion, even though ATG is found said to be depleting agent and is not used that freely, however, our study has shown that ATG can be safer, effective, and preferable over BS for high-risk transplant recipients. Limitation was it's a single sector study, small sample size, variable data, and a short duration of follow-up. Thank you very much.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
What proportion of patients in both groups had steroid or CNI withdrawn at some point, and was it accounted for in the analysis?
Ma'am, I haven't done that subgroup analysis of the same. Mostly steroid withdrawal, we try to withdraw over a period of 6 months to a minimum dose of 5 or 2.5.
Yeah,
Yes,
so
ma'am.
basically steroid and CNI withdrawal are potential confounders which might affect your long-term.
Yes, ma'am. I will look into it and try to do a subgroup analysis of the same, ma'am.
Not a subgroup analysis, a Cox proportional hazard model.
Yes, ma'am.
All of your patients received induction therapy? Or is it a matter of your hospital policy? All patients will receive induction therapy?
Sir, can you just repeat the question?
All patients received induction therapy.
No, sir. In our hospital, all patients do not receive, especially if it's a haplomatch, like a parent to child or siblings, we do not give induction therapy for the same.
Okay, did you compare that with patients who received induction versus who didn't receive induction therapy?
No, sir, not in this study. In this study, I have only compared basiliximab versus ATG. However, there were 46 people who were not receiving induction. Their data has not been analyzed in this study.
The title actually you could have renamed, no? Basically you compared basiliximab versus ATG. No, I mean, yeah, the title so reflected what you have studied.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I think we'll conclude. I think here, because we have already exceeded time.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, moderators. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Vivek Goyal. The topic of his presentation is pulmonary mucormycosis after renal transplant, a single center experience.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dr. Vivek from Sir Gangaram Hospital, and my paper is pulmonary mucormycosis after renal transplant in the pre-COVID era, a single center experience. Invasive fungal infections after renal transplant are uncommon, occurring in 1 to 14% of the recipients, and mucor represents an incidence of 0.2 to 1.2%. Mucor is a rare but potentially fatal opportunistic infection following renal transplant. Our study aims to assess the characteristics, risk factors, and outcomes associated with pulmonary mucor infection, specifically in renal allograft recipients. It was a single center retrospective study of the renal allograft recipients transplanted between January 2005 and December 2019. Hospital records were reviewed for the evidence of pulmonary mucor infection specifically in renal allograft recipients at the Department of Nephrology, Sir Gangaram Hospital, New Delhi, India. This is a tabular representation of the patients who were found to be the same. The results that we found were total 1945 patients underwent renal transplant during the time period, out of which 36 patients, so an incidence of 0.8% had mucormycosis, and 9 specially had pulmonary involvement, incidence of 0.4%, all were live related. All patients were male and the mean age was 42 years. 77.8% were diabetic, which was in accordance with most of the studies which have been published, and 33% patients that were ABO incompatible, all B2O. All patients got induction therapy, 4 got Fresenius ATG and thymoglobulin each, and 1 got basiliximab. 8 out of 9 were on triple drug immunosuppression, that is TAC, prednisolone and MMF, and only 1 was on prednisolone and azathioprine. Now, this was in sharp contrast to other studies which have shown azathioprine to be more associated with mucormycosis. However, this could be biased because our institute uses MMF as a primary immunosuppression therapy. Now, the time interval between the transplant and pulmonary mucor varied greatly between 2 months to 11 years. The median was 6 months. This was again in accordance with the published data, which shows that the incidence is highest during the first year, which is the stage of intense immunosuppression. Most common symptoms were fever and cough in approximately 80% patients. Other features were chest pain, expectoration, shortness of breath, or weight loss. Now, the differential of fever and cough in a renal allograft recipient could be many. So, one requires a lot of clinical suspicion and prompt investigation with an X-ray, CT scan, and maybe even a bronchoscopy or a lavage to diagnose mucor in a renal allograft recipient. Suspected as patients, as I said, were evaluated by the same, and many patients were diagnosed with bronchoalveolar lavage and even transbronchial biopsy. The diagnosis were proven to the EORTC criteria. In radiology, we found cavitatory lesion in 4 out of 9 patients and consolidation in the 5. And 5 patients were diagnosed with the bronchoalveolar lavage. 3 patients suffered acute graft dysfunction during the course due to reduction of the immunosuppression therapy, out of which 2 of them resolved spontaneously and 1 could not be biopsied due to poor general condition. The management included a combination of reduction of immunosuppression therapy, antifungal therapy, and surgical debridement of the infected tissues. All patients were given IV liposomal amphotericin B at the specified dose, and surgery in the form of lobectomy or debridement was done in almost all patients except 1. Now, this was a CT finding in one of our patients, which showed an area of consolidation with areas of internal ground glassing, which was a reversed halo sign, which was previously described in invasive aspergillosis, but now has been described in mucor. These are the photographs that show a numerous non-septate fungal hyphae that is on the figure 3, and figure 2 shows the area of necrosis. As we know, mucor is an angio-invasive infection. So, as I said, all were specifically of the B2O blood group, and blood group O has been seen to be correlated with increased risk of certain infections like TB, mumps, while A has been seen to be associated with increased risk of Pseudomonas infection due to maybe the blood group receptors acting as facilitation for certain pathogens. Whether this blood group combination is linked to mucor needs further studies. The mortality in our study was only 22.2%, while most of the patients survived. This is probably one of the highest survival rate compared to any other published data. Even many of the previous studies have reported that the outcome in pulmonary mucormycosis specifically was worse than in patients with rhino-orbital cerebral involvement. The better survival rate in our study was probably due to early initiation of antifungal therapy and timely intervention by the thoracic surgery department. To conclude, mucor has been in the scheme of things lately complicating COVID-19. Though our case review finished in December 19, the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the prevalence of mucor greatly, both in recipients, renal allograft recipients and otherwise. In an unpublished data of 5 renal allograft recipients who developed COVID-associated mucor, 3 developed rhino-orbital, 1 pulmonary and 1 cerebral each. Ours is one of the largest single-center reported data from India on mucormycosis specifically affecting the lung and renal transplant recipients. The drawbacks, however, of this study were that it was a retrospective and observational study. Multicentric, prospective and controlled clinical trials would further substantiate our observations. To conclude, mucormycosis is a rare but life-threatening infective complication of kidney transplant. A high index of suspicion leading to an early diagnosis, timely institution of combination therapy and of antifungal and surgery is a key to survival. Thank you very much.
What proportion of your patients had extra pulmonary involvement?
Ma'am, out of 36 patients in total who had mucor, only 9 had pulmonary involvement. So other 27 patients had extra pulmonary involvement.
Some patients require wound debridement and lumpectomy, something like that. What about the remaining percentage? 12% of patients doesn't require any form of surgical treatment.
So could you please repeat your question, sir?
Out of your the patients, 12% of patients doesn't require any form of surgical management.
No, sir. Out of the 9 patients, 2 could not be debribed upon because one refused and one had a very poor general condition.
Okay.
It was tried in all the patients, sir.
Okay. And how long will you do amphotericin B? Liposomal amphotericin?
Sir, it was given for over a period of 40 to 21 days, sir. And it varied greatly upon the extent of clinical involvement and the presentation also, sir.
And how did you assess the response rate?
Sir, the dosage was, sir, the dosage, the mean dose ranged between 2.5 gram to 3.5 grams in total, sir. And, sir.
What was the HbA1c of your diabetics at the time of the disease?
Sir, HbA1c has not been.
I'm not sure if you showed it.
No, sir, I have not shown it, sir. It has.
That's a very important factor, no? I mean, what was the sugar control in your diabetics? Most of them are diabetics, 7 or 8 of them.
Yes, sir. Most of them were diabetics.
Yes. So, what was the sugar control?
Actually, sir, many of them had were infected with mucor even before 3 months post-transplant. So, HbA1c could be spurious in the first 3 months post-transplant. So, that is why I said could not analyze it using HbA1c.
Okay, thank you. Then I think we'll conclude your paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, moderators. Now I invite Dr. Tarshid Ali Jahangir. The topic of his presentation is Single Center Experience of Kidney Grafts with Multiple Renal Arteries During Renal Transplantation, a 13-year experience.
So my topic for discussion is a single center experience on in patients with multiple renal arteries. But the problem with CKD, the global problem, and as you can see, it's in the 2017 Lancet trial, there were 700 million cases worldwide. Now, the global prevalence being 9.1% and 1.2 million people actually died from CKD. It's diabetic nephropathy accounting for 1/3 of the disability adjusted life in those times. Number of people receiving renal replacement therapy as of now stands at 2.5 million, which in due course of time, according to Lancet data, by 2030 would be 5.4 million people. Looking at the problem in the Indian scenario, this is the number of CKD patients which we had around 2017 to 2018, which is 115 million. That is around 9529 by 100,000 as the prevalence rate, and 115.1 million would be exactly the amount of patients who are actually having CKD. If you look at the global scenario, it's actually 700 million is more than the combined people having diabetes, osteoarthritis, and COPD. So looking at the Indian problem again, this is the number of people who actually require renal transplantation in India. That's 220,000. So what do we have now? We perform 7,500 to 10,000 renal transplants in over 250 centers, which is more likely to increase as of now.
But this is the 2017-18 data. So our performance is 4.545%. Now, how as we as surgeons would try to enhance the performance by to improve this the scenario in which we can take in more donors and we can perform more transplantation. It's a huge mountain to climb, and we are just starting to go in, because this, if you can see in the pie chart, we have 10,000 people who have actually been transplanted, or 220,000 people who actually require the transplantation. So the need of the hour would be to increase the donor pool. Now surgeons can do very little to increase the donor pool, but what we have tried in our center to increase the donor pool is by accommodating kidneys with anatomical complexities, primarily the vascular complexities, which is much more important. Here, one very such common anatomical complexity would be the multiple renal arteries. Previously, it was a deterrent, or rather a relative contraindication. Now we have taken into a stride to increase the number of patients with multiple renal arteries into our transplantation program. If you look into the multiple renal arteries, 18-30% of the incidence cadaveric studies have suggested that total around 25% would be the average number of patients who are having multiple, donors who are having multiple renal arteries. So if we can accommodate them, we can actually increase the donor pool by 25%. Why multiple renal artery was a deterrent? Because it was actually known to increase the warm ischemia time, increase the incidence of ATN, rejection, and thereby decrease the graft function, and hence prolong the hospitalization. It was also associated with arterial thrombosis, and one very important thing was the renal artery stenosis. Our experience is this: from April 2008 to July 2021, we have had 4,453 transplantations performed in our hospital, out of which 1,768 were open donor nephrectomies and 2,685 till July were laparoscopic donor nephrectomies. With the idea of laparoscopic donor nephrectomies is that the multiple renal arteries can be more easily procured. We had 865 multiple renal arteries, the standard of 90.45%, 787 were two renal arteries, 71 three renal arteries, and we had 7 four renal arteries. So what did we do? The donor artery, we actually, in all our cases in the previous time till 2013, we used to have a smaller renal artery, generally the lower pole or the upper pole. We tried to anastomose them individually to the epigastric or to the internal iliac. But with our recent experiences, we have tried to perform multiple arteries with single anastomosis. Up to 4 arteries, we have tried to pantaloon them. It's called double pantaloon. And by doing that, we have actually performed a good number of patients with complete perfusion. You can see the data, it's very elaborate at this side. The mean creatinine levels in all the three, group A, group B, and C, over 3 months, 1 year, and 5 years, was supposed to be almost comparative. The graft survival in group A, group B, and group C in all three cases were mostly comparable. In 5 years, we have had a decline in the graft survival. The patient survival was also similar in these cases. The renal, what we have found in our vascular complications group, we've had 2 cases of renal artery thrombosis, one of renal vein thrombosis, in which we unfortunately had to lose the patient. There were 2 patients with renal artery stenosis. This happened, it was very unfortunate that these 2 renal artery stenosis very unlikely happened within the first 7 days, which is very, very uncommon. The patients had completely, the hypertension was not going down, which is what suspected us to re-anastomose and re-look in, but we actually could not save the kidney. The bleeding for renal artery episodes in group A, group B, and group C in total was comparatively negligible, and in all cases the p-value was not significant. This is just a picture diagram as to what is the picture of the renal donors which we had taken. There were 4 renal arteries in this. You can see there are 4 renal arteries.
You have already exceeded 5 minutes. Please be fast.
I'll just finish it off, ma'am. This is just pictorial description of the 4 renal arteries perforation, double pantaloon technique which we have done, and I'll just give you a video of the performance. After the perfusion, we have seen that all the 4 all the 4 arteries have adequately perfused the kidneys. This is the 4th one. This is the renal vein. So in that, I would further like to conclude that even though the woods are lovely, dark and deep in the downtown transplantation program, we do not think that multiple renal arteries should not be an obstacle towards renal transplantation. Thank you.
What was the ischemia time when 1 artery, 2 arteries, 3 arteries, and 4 arteries?
So the warm ischemia time will remain the same. There is a cold ischemia time which is enhanced because in
What was the cold ischemia time in all?
the cold ischemia time
Yeah.
in two renal arteries is just 5 minutes or 4.5 minutes or 5 minutes more, because the anastomosis time in the cold ischemia time in two renal arteries, the Pantaloons technique takes around approximately 3.5 to 4 minutes, which we perform regularly, and for 3 arteries we take around 4.5 to 5 minutes.
Okay, and as far as possible, you try to anastomose them individually into separate arteries.
No, what we have done is called a double for 2 arteries we generally join them together by a Pantaloons technique, and for 3 arteries we perform what is called a petal technique. But this is our technique which we perform when we do a Pantaloon in both the 2 arteries, and then the 3rd artery we anastomose it by side. And for 4 arteries, the 2 lateral walls of the 2 arteries are joined together in both sides, and then the medial common walls of the other 2 arteries are joined together, which I have shown in the diagram, in the picture actually.
What proportion, how many patients had any vascular thrombosis or anything of this age?
As I said, there were 2 patients who had renal artery thrombosis. One had a renal artery stenosis, and one had a renal vein thrombosis patient in this trial.
Okay, thank you. Then I think we will conclude your paper. Thank you very much, Dr. Jahangir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, moderators. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Ankur Mittal. The topic of his presentation is Prevalence of Genetic Mutations Associated with Kidney Disorders in a Renal Transplant Recipient's Single Center Experience.
Good evening, everyone. I am presenting my paper on prevalence of genetic mutation associated with kidney disorders in a renal transplant recipient, which is a single center experience. End-stage renal disease of undetermined etiology is highly prevalent and constitute a significant clinical challenge, particularly in the context of kidney transplantation. Underlying renal conditions leading to ESRD are extremely heterogeneous. Prevalence of hereditary nephropathy among adults with ESRD is less known, and to date, less than 10% of the adult ESRD is thought to be genetic. Renal histology often proves inapplicable in patients with ESRD due to atrophic kidney. A significant proportion of patients remain classified under CKD of undetermined etiology due to lack of definite cause prior to the kidney transplantation. Since the primary etiology of the ESRD may affect the graft survival, hence it is crucial to have the knowledge of underlying kidney disease in the context of transplantation. Genetic analysis often reveals the cause of kidney failure in patients with unknown kidney disease. For patients awaiting renal transplantation, genetic testing prior to the kidney transplant may help to understand the outcome in these patients. My aim and objective of the study was to study the role of pre-transplant genetic analysis in a patient of ESRD and to study the prevalence of complement regulatory gene mutation in patients with ESRD undergoing renal transplantation. It was a single-center observational cohort study conducted at Mulji Patel Urological Hospital from October 2019 to July 2021, and all patients undergoing live donor renal transplant were included, and those who didn't give consent were excluded. Multiplex ligation probe amplification was done, and clinical exam sequencing was performed to confirm the genetic mutation. Total 123 patients were included. Out of those, 88 had the undetermined native kidney disease, and 35 patients had the established cause for renal disease, mainly congenital or hereditary, that include the ADPKD, Alport syndrome, or CACOS, or non-hereditary that mainly include the diabetic kidney disease, IgA nephropathy, obstructive uropathy, TTID, or the leukonephritis. Among the patients with undetermined ESRD, out of those 88, 17 patients underwent the renal histology prior to the transplantation. Out of those, 8 had chronic GN on the renal biopsy, and 6 has glomerulosclerosis, 2 TMA, and 1 patient showed the advanced renal damage on the renal biopsy. And 71 patients remain undiagnosed, and there was no renal histology was done prior to the kidney transplantation. Among the patients who had the genetic or hereditary cause, diagnosed cause of native kidney disease like ADPKD, Alport syndrome, and CACOT, that was confirmed by the genetic analysis. And among the CACOT, only 1 patient had we could not find any genetic mutation, and remaining 3 patients we found the mutation for ROBO1 to TBX18 gene and 1 for MYO6 that was likely pathogenic as it was reported. Among the after the performing the genetic testing, there was a change in the diagnosis after genetic testing among the patient with undetermined native kidney disease. 10 were found to have a mutation for FSGS or steroid-resistant nephrotic syndrome, 5 with CGM, 10 with cystic renal disease, 2 patients among nephropathy of unknown origin, and 2 with CACOT. Among patients of unknown kidney disease, even after genetic testing, 1 patient was found to have a PAG gene mutation which was previously implicated in the pathogenesis of AHVS. Number of patients that we could found for the complement regulatory gene mutation was significantly high, mainly for CFHR1 and CFHR3 genes, where duplication was seen in 60 patients and homozygosity was seen in 13 patients, and remaining CFHR3 mutation was duplication was also seen in 3 patients, which was isolated, and there was no mutation in any other gene. And other patients also were found to have CFI MCP mutation, CPA mutation. Duplication of gene in these 63 patients were also reported as variant of uncertain significance, and the prevalence among these 123 patients was nearly 70% of occurrence of complement regulatory gene mutation. Among the patients with established kidney disease, complement regulatory gene mutation, maybe hereditary kidney disease, congenital kidney disease, who already had the diagnosed native kidney disease, were also found to have a mutation in some of the complement regulatory gene, but significance of these mutations has remained uncertain. One of the impact of this study, after performing genetic testing, there was a significant change of number of patients from 88 to 70, and these 18 patients were transferred from the undetermined cause to the congenital hereditary cause that were previously been indicated as undetermined etiology. But after the performing genetic testing, they were reclassified into the congenital hereditary cause with a p-value of 0.006, which was significant, and the only 70 patients will remain undiagnosed after the performing of genetic testing. To conclude, this study demonstrated around 83% prevalence of genetic mutation in the renal transplant recipient, and genetic analysis provide the etiology in nearly 30% of the patient undetermined kidney disease, and significance of the complement regulatory gene related mutation remain uncertain.
So, what do you suggest? Would you suggest, based on the results of your study, would you suggest genetic testing in all patients without an identifiable native kidney disease? And what are you going to achieve by doing a genetic testing?
Primarily in patients with the undetermined native kidney disease, one should know the cause of the disease. Like the patient we had who is having the CFI mutation, that was also reported as uncertain significant. But that patient, after the renal transplantation, had his graft loss, and ultimately leading to loss of his kidney. And presently, he's on maintenance hemodialysis. And again, the few of the patients were also, as I said, were reclassified. And those who didn't have the mutation, we can guide the prognosis and adjust. Like in cases of AHES, the dosage of the tacrolimus, we can consider that if there is prevalence of the CFX mutation or the CFI mutation, we can adjust the dose of tacrolimus, which is also the cause of the thrombotic microangiopathy, along with if the patient is also already having the mutation for the susceptible gene.
That's actually a very wide speculation, I would say, because what we don't know is the prevalence of complement component, like this uncertain significance, unless actually you are finding it in multiple family members, it is not going to be of much relevance. And again, most of the conditions are autosomal, like you have to have 2 copies, and this uncertain significance, and the majority of the mutations which you found was uncertain significance,
Yes,
right?
Yes,
Yeah.
but
So we have to know how much is the population prevalence. Even if actually
Yes.
a couple of us, we will be harboring mutations of uncertain significance.
It has been reported, ma'am, like in Nigeria, the prevalence of complement regulatory gene mutation is around 10%. I mean, one of the studies in Pakistan, the Southeast Asian country, the prevalence is around 25 to 30%. That was reported from Pakistan for the mutation for the complement regulatory gene. But again, the 64% mutation that we would found that study requires long-term study, and the case and control in the and we also like to know the mutation in the population. Only then we can guide the impact of the mutation to those to these patients. And again, the patient with diabetic kidney, all the diabetic kidney disease patients, like all the diabetic patients, do not ultimately land up into diabetic kidney disease. But in this study, out of those 17 patients of diabetic kidney disease, 12 had the mutation for complement regulatory gene. So there might be a possibility of affecting some of the other characteristics of.
So what is the population prevalence of complement component abnormalities in your geographic area? Is there any data?
No, ma'am.
Without knowing that,
there is no data that has been published from India.
Yeah, without knowing that, you cannot generalize that actually these are of pathologic significance.
Yeah, that's why it was labeled as uncertain significance. But we are looking forward for this study, is the ongoing study, and we are still looking for the post-transplant complication in these patients and the occurrence of the TMA. Like all these patients, 7 patients out of these 123 patients had the post-transplant TMA, and out of those 7 patients, 4 had mutation for the complement regulatory gene, and out of those 4, 2 had the homozygosity and 2 had the heterozygosity for CFHR3, and one had the graft loss, as I said, that is the mutation for CFI gene.
So if there are no more questions, we will wind up. Thank you for a nice presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am. Humble request from the organization for the next 3 presentation, please stick to the time. Thank you. Moving on, I would like to invite Dr. Najaf Izadeh. The topic of her presentation is correlation of number of brain dead potential donors detectors in estimating the number of detected possible donors.
In the name of God, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to give a lecture about organ donation in Iran. Today I'm going to talk about the correlation of number of brain death potential donors in estimating number of detected possible donors. As you know better than me, detection of potential donors is one of the most important parts of organ donation process. Iranian Society of Organ Donation in Iran actually developed a method for detecting potential donors that is named PPDDP, that I will explain about that a little bit. In this study, we evaluated the effectiveness of detecting the potential donors by the detectors. What is PPDDP process? We actually hire some inspectors, some nurses as inspectors. They go to the hospitals one by one and evaluate every comatose patient in every ICU of the hospitals on their coverage of every university. If in their evaluation they could find eligible donor, they inform chief coordinator, and chief coordinator send the coordinator to evaluate that potential donors. And also, if they find a potential donor with a comatose patient with GCS 4 or 5, or someone with GCS 3 but not brain deaf, they inform telephone detectors. We have some telephone detectors who call to the hospitals. And if the telephone detector in follow-up find that this patient with GCS 3 or 3 non-brain deaf or GCS 4 or 5 is now brain deaf, for example, the day after informing about brain deaf case, they inform chief coordinator, and chief coordinator send the coordinator to that hospital. So we have 3 different parts for detecting the potential donors. We have inspectors that go to the hospital and check every comatose patient, and also we have telephone detectors, and also we have hospital report. They inform the OPU about any comatose patient with GCS 3, 4, and 5. Okay, in our study, in 8 months, because now we have national registry that our NGO developed this registry for Ministry of Health, and so we developed this registry, and from the registry we can now follow every hospital, and we can follow the number of detected possible donors, and we know about the number of detectors in every organ procurement unit, and also we know about the ICU beds. We also know about the number of fatal road accidents and number of the population in every region. So we evaluated the correlation between the number of detectors and the number of detected cases. 37 out of 60 medical universities in Iran, because in Iran every medical university have some hospitals under the coverage. So 37 out of 60 medical universities that are now using PPDDP method for detecting the possible donors participated in this study. During 8 months, we had 2,378 possible donors detected, and we compared the number of detected cases with the number of detectors, and also with the number of road accident fatalities, and with the number of ICU beds and everything. Interestingly, there was a significant correlation between the number of detectors and the number of detected cases. And also road accident fatalities had a significant correlation with that. In summary, any additional monthly rate of road fatalities had a significant correlation with the number of possible donors detected, and also monthly detected rate of possible donors per million had a significant correlation with the number of detectors. Every detector who was added to the system could increase the number of detected possible donors 1 per million. As a conclusion, because educating the detectors is just have a lower cost of training coordinators, we recommend to every, especially underdeveloped countries or developing countries, to use detectors for detecting possible donors instead of training too many coordinators to increase the number of possible donors detected. Thank you very much.
Just want to ask a clarification. These detectors are basically some sort of administrative person. I mean, what is the basic qualification of this detector? How do you choose a detector?
These are just middle-aged nurses who are really experienced in ICU management, and we train them about brain death detection. We teach them how to examine a GCS 3, 4, or 5 case, and to find out if this comatose patient is brain deaf or not. And we give the permission to these detectors from the university, and they have the permission to go to the different hospitals any time during the day.
So they're ICU nurses basically. From the
they
hospital.
are ICU nurses, and most of them are middle-aged, and most of them are supervisor or matron in any hospital.
So, sorry, sir.
Yes, yes. Continue.
So what you're telling is, like, in addition to the regular responsibilities, these people will be detecting the possible brain dead donors, right?
Yeah, but not in their hospital. The organ procurement units hire these people. For example, for 5 million people under our OPU coverage, we had 6 detectors. These detectors were from different hospitals, but we hired them and sent them to different hospitals. We had 60 hospitals, 60 hospitals under our coverage. They used to go to these hospitals to detect the possible donors after their work. I mean, in the morning, they were working in their own hospitals. In the afternoon, they worked for OPU, going to these 60 hospitals according to a very sophisticated schedule. For example, for some trauma centers, we used to send these detectors every day to detect, to look for possible donors. But for some hospitals, for example, some hospitals without neurosurgery ward, we used to send them just maybe twice a week. So they had a schedule after their work. They used to go to these hospitals and examine every comatose patient one by one. And if they could find a GCS 3, 4, or 5 patient, they used to inform telephone detector and also chief coordinator if the patient was brain dead.
Okay, thank you, madam. Thank you very much for a nice paper, madam. We'll move on. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. Next, I'd like to invite Chandni Kota. The topic of the presentation is Influence of CYPA3A5 polymorphism on tacrolimus dosing in renal transplant recipients. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Today I am going to speak on influence of CYP3A5 polymorphisms on tacrolimus dosing in renal transplant recipients. We all know that tacrolimus is a commonly used immunosuppressant after kidney transplantation, and because of its narrow therapeutic range and demonstration of wide inter-individual variability, pharmacokinetics, leading to potential under immunosuppression or toxicity. And we all know that it is mainly metabolized by CYP3A5 enzymes. Genetic polymorphisms in this enzyme expression contributes to differences in tacrolimus bioavailability between individuals. So there were many alleles in the CYP3A5 polymorphisms. Most common 3-type genotypes were found, that is expressors 1-1 wild type allele, intermediate expressors or 1-3, and non-expressors, that is 3-3 alleles. Our main aim of the study is to evaluate pharmacogenomic effect of CYP3A5 gene polymorphism on tacrolimus dosing in renal transplant recipients. As is a single center retrospective observational study in 32 renal transplant recipients. We collected 2 ml of blood in EDTA tube and genomic DNA was extracted by silica column based protocol, and few nanogram of DNA was sampled by RT-PCR MPA in duplicates, thus yielding a total of 2 replicates. This CYP3A5 polymorphism detected from each of the 2 replicates. So we included patients with stable graft function on tacrolimus based immunosuppression and excluded patients on drugs which are known to cause interactions with CYP. That is, CYP inducers or inhibitors were excluded. We collected demographic data, weight adjusted tacrolimus data was collected, serum TAC level at 1 month, 3 months and 1 year was noted. All data related to rejection episodes and drug toxicity were collected. All patients were genotyped for CYP3A5 polymorphism alleles and data was statistically analyzed, which was approved by Ethical Committee from Osmania Medical College. We have the demographic data results. More we have with the CKD-U patients, and majority were males. So coming to our major results, that is CYP allele, CA5 alleles, we have 60% intermediate metabolizers, that is heterozygotes 1/3, and 28% poor metabolizers 3/3, and 12% were extensive metabolizers. So we have compared clinical characteristics of study population among the 3 genotypes, which we discuss in detail. So we have plotted a graph, that is average TAC level was plotted among the 3 genotypes. The upper one, gray one, is a poor metabolizer, which showed higher TAC level when compared to the intermediate and the extensive metabolizer at day 4, day 10 and at the end of 1 month and also at the end of 3 months. So which showed the poor metabolizers, among poor metabolizers at the end of 1 month, 55% had higher TAC level, that is more than 10 nanogram per ml. And after multiple dose modifications also, we found that poor metabolizers, that is 33% of the poor metabolizers still had higher TAC level, that is more than 7 nanogram per ml. So coming to the results of genotypes, after being started with 0.1 mg per kg per day, expressors, that is fast metabolizers, required multiple dose escalations and mean dose was around 0.15 milligram per kg per day. And poor metabolizers required more dose reductions, that is mean dose was 0.06 mg per kg per day. So we plotted a graph of rejections where poor metabolizers showed none rejections, whereas fast metabolizers showed 75% showed rejections, with significant p-value less than 0.01. And we have plotted results with TAF toxicity, where we found 46.8% had hypertension and 37% had abnormal lipid profile, NODAT with insulin dependency in 12.5%, AKI, hyperuricemia, infections, tremors in the other populations. So coming to the hypertension, so we had 46.8% patients had hypertension, out of which 53% were developed post-transplant, that is new onset hypertension after transplantation, and 4 patients developed PRES, because of which 2 patients had to stop tacrolimus, and out of 7 patients with the previous hypertension, 4 patients had worsening of hypertension requiring multiple antihypertensives. This showed a significant p-value of less than 0.05. Coming to new onset diabetes after transplantation, none of the extensive metabolizers developed post-transplant diabetes, but 55% of poor metabolizers developed NODAT and 31.6% developed Nodatin intermediate metabolizers. So we have compared our study across the globe with Egyptian, Chinese, and our Indian study, Stanley Medical College, and Iranian study. We found more of intermediate metabolizers, that is 60% were about intermediate metabolizers, and which were correlating with other studies where Iranian people had less of intermediate metabolizers and Egyptian had very low population with the fast metabolizers, and Iran population had more of poor metabolizers. These are the different results of TAC level, and we have compared CYP3A5 polymorphism genotype variation across different regions in India. Our study population showed higher intermediate group population, whereas North Indian showed more of poor metabolizers, that is 49.59%, and Chennai population had different, that is 47.5 intermediate and 40.6 poor metabolizers, whereas in Kerala we found to have more rapid metabolizers, that is 20% rapid metabolizers and 60% poor metabolizers. Because of this, we know that different regions have different metabolizers. And coming to our conclusion, tacrolimus drug level, it is very well correlated with the presence or absence of CYP3A5 polymorphisms, and we found that fast metabolizers had higher dose requirement, that is 2 times higher dose, and poor metabolizers had less dose for the maintenance, and intermediate metabolizers were in between 2. In our study, we found most common polymorphism was intermediate metabolizers. So, our conclusion is, like, if we start, if we give genotype based dosing from the day of transplant, we can have shorter time to achieve the target level, target trough level, and less number of dose modification. We can reduce the pill burden, we can reduce the cost of burden, and lower patient intravariability, and we can set a trend towards preventing rejections, and we can avoid many TAC related toxicity. Limitations: ours is a small sample size, larger study groups are required for the validation of effect of genotyping on clinical outcomes, and prospective genotype based dosing is still needed.
So how many days it took for fast metabolizers to reach the therapeutic TAC levels after initiation?
Ma'am, actually fast metabolizers, they required only very few dose modifications, 2 modifications, like at the end of 1 month they have attained therapeutic level, therapeutic range, but poor metabolizers required multiple dose modifications, 4 to 5 dose modifications. They had to, we had to reduce the dose like 0.5 mg like every week or every 15 days after the discharge and after transplant, and by the end of 3 months they achieved the range, that is 7 to 10 nanogram per ml, and after that also when we compared with the fast metabolizers, they are still on the higher side. When we compare to the intermediate and fast metabolizers, poor metabolizers had like still higher TAC level, and all poor metabolizers developed TAC related toxicity. One or the either toxicity was present in all the poor metabolizers, like hypertension, NODAT, some of the other TAC related toxicity was observed.
Your follow-up period is only 6 months. You don't have any long-term data on graph?
Ma'am, this is 2 years follow-up, ma'am, actually. Still we are continuing the study, and we have started prospective genotype-based dosing also. Sooner we'll present the comparison study between like control group and the like conventional based dosing and the genotype-based dosing. Sooner we'll have the data. Because of COVID, like we had less transplant.
Okay.
As per your statistics, you have only less than 50% of patients who had hypertension prior to transplant. Less than 50% of patients.
Yes, sir. Like 46.8% like had hypertension. But ours is a like small sample size. I think if we have more patients, like we can provide more data on this hypertension related toxicity.
I request the moderators to kindly wind up the session.
Press and 2 patients had severe press with visual disturbances, optic neuropathy, and we had to stop tacrolimus in those 2 patients. And other patients also had worsening, like previous patients who had like previous hypertension, they had worsening of hypertension among the poor metabolizers and requiring multiple antihypertensives.
Now I invite our final presenter of the day, Dr. Gaurav Bandhari. The topic of his presentation is No Cardiosis in Kidney Transplant Patients, Single Center Study.
Good evening, ma'am. Good evening, sir. My topic is no cardiosis in kidney transplant patients. It is a single center study. Nocardiosis.
Dr. Gaurav, I'll just interrupt here. Please mention your center. It is not there in your title slide.
So yeah, it was a retrospective study done at Gangaram Hospital, sir, New Delhi. Nocardiosis is a rare opportunistic infection seen in kidney transplant patients, which is caused by aerobic actinomycete. Incidence of nocardiosis in kidney transplant patients is rare and varies from 0.7 to 2.6%. And the disease manifestations can vary from a localized infection, which is like lungs, to the multisystem disorder. However, lungs are the most common involved most common involved organ in nocardiosis. Multisystem and cerebral nocardiosis has poor prognosis and is associated with increased mortality. So our study, it was a retrospective single center study, which was done from 2010 to 2019. Total 1800 kidney transplant patients were done, and the kidney transplant patients with age more than 18 years diagnosed with nocardiosis either on gram stain, modified acid fast stain, or culture were included. The clinical and microbiological data of these patients were retrospectively analyzed, and introduction of subspecies identification was possible from the last 3 years of our study. So a total of 1800 kidney transplants were done from 2010 to 2019, of which 16 cases of nocardiosis were diagnosed, which gives an incidence of around 0.88%. And the majority of the cases were males with a median age of 44 years. The comorbidities like diabetes was present in 18.75%, and the median time from transplant to nocardiosis was around 21 months. And acute rejection episodes and CMV infection within 6 months of nocardiosis was found in around 12.5% and 25% respectively. The most common organ involvement was lungs, which is around 75%, followed by brain around 12.5%. 1% showed cutaneous involvement, and a severe form of infection in the form of disseminated infection was seen in one patient. And the mean creatinine presentation was around 0.7 milligram per deciliter. There was no incidence of AKI seen in these patients, and 5 patients died with a mortality rate of 31.25%, while 68.75% recovered. So the incidence of nocardiosis in solid organ transplant ranges from 0.6% to 2.65%, and among solid organ transplant, the highest incidence is seen in lung transplant patients. In India, the kidney transplant patients, the incidence is around 1.44%, and our study reported an incidence of 0.88%. And lungs are the most commonly involved organ, as we all see, and similar findings were found in our study. Species identification is important as it guides the treatment. After the introduction of MALDI-TOF at our center, 6 patients were diagnosed with nocardiosis, of which 4 patients were infected with Nocardia farcinica, 1 patient with Nocardia vallesi, and 1 patient with Nocardia cryogerica. So Nocardia farcinica is most predominant species isolated in solid organ transplants, and similar findings were found in our study. Nocardia farcinica caused all pulmonary, disseminated, and brain infection. It was resistant to cotrimoxazole, which used to be the first line of treatment for nocardiosis and before the subspecies identification. Cotrimoxazole prophylaxis has been in use in our center in most of the kidney transplant patients. 9 out of 6 patients had received cotrimoxazole prophylaxis. However, this prophylaxis doesn't protect against nocardia as seen in some of the studies, and due to the lack of control, such association could not be analyzed in our study. However, nocardiosis didn't occur when patients were on this cotrimoxazole prophylaxis. Treatment of choice for nocardiosis is cotrimoxazole. It can be used in combination with following drugs like imipenem, meropenem, linezolid, amikacin, fluoroquinolones, or minocycline. Ideally, the treatment should be based on culture sensitivity report and using a combination of drugs for systemic illness. In our study, 7 patients received imipenem plus linezolid combination, 5 patients received combination of imipenem plus amikacin, and 4 patients received cotrimoxazole only. The mortality was seen in 5 patients, around 31.25%, even though incidence is rare. Cerebral nocardiosis has poor prognosis and was associated with increased mortality. All the 2 patients which were diagnosed with cerebral nocardiosis died in our study, and similar findings were found in our case with 100% mortality. So this is the thing where we see total of 16 patients were involved, of which lung is the most common. And in subspecies, which was subspecies identification was introduced at our center in the later 3 years of the study, where Nocardia farcinica was the most common organism, and it is resistant to the cotrimoxazole drug, which used to be the drug of choice for nocardia. So conclusion, though nocardiosis in kidney transplant patients has a very low incidence, but it is an important cause of mortality. Nocardia farcinica is a predominant species and is resistant to Ciptran, that is cotrimoxazole. Cerebral and disseminated nocardiosis has poor prognosis, and drug sensitivity is an important tool to guide treatment.
What proportion of these patients with nocardiosis had received induction treatment? And what was
All the 16 patients had received treatment, of which 15 patients had received ATG and 1 patient had received ATG Fresenius, that is Graflon, ma'am. All the 16 patients had received induction agents.
You reduce the immunosuppression in all the patients after diagnosis? What was the immunosuppression?
Mycept was withheld. However, we continued with tacrolimus and steroids, sir.
And what was the TAC level in these patients?
The TAC level was around 4.2. Mean TAC levels of all the 6 patients was around 4.2 nanogram per ml, sir.
Okay, if there are no more questions, we will wind up the session. Thank you, Dr. Gaurav, for this presentation.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, moderators. With this, we have come to an end for the free paper session. I thank all the speakers and moderators for sharing their valuable knowledge in this academic event. Once again, I thank each one of you to be a part of the day 1 of ISOT 2021. Hope to see you all for the coming scientific session. Thank you.